People ask me sometimes what I did in the dispersal. Not the military people, they've seen the records and they don't ask. Civilians ask. Young people mostly, the ones who grew up after the corridors opened and the transit lines stopped charging in hardship currency. They hear dispersal veteran and picture something cinematic. A firefight, a last stand, a hand on a detonator. I tell them I stamped a piece of paper. That's usually when they stop asking. But it's the truth. The thing I'm most proud of in 41 years of service is a gray fiberpaper ration chit, 4 centimeters square, pre-printed with a 7-character alphanumeric code in cadmium-red ink. GX-441-R, I carried a booklet of 300 of them in my supply kit the morning we arrived at Vethani Transit Processing Station 11. I walked out of that station with 299. The one I gave away stopped a deportation order and cleared a line of 300 human families who had been standing on a composite floor for 11 hours with their luggage and their children and nothing to eat. I was 26. I was a supply runner attached to the 44th Humanitarian Element, which was a title that meant we carried things from one place to another and tried not to get anyone killed in the process. The Vethani had agreed to take refugees under the Provisional Dispersal Accord, and on paper that arrangement was clean and orderly. The processing stations had intake counters staffed by Vethani civil officers, and the officers had scanner arrays, and the refugees had documentation kits assembled by our liaison team, and everything was meant to flow. It did not flow. What the liaison team had not accounted for, what nobody had accounted for, because nobody had ever needed to before, was that the Vethani scanner arrays were built on a toxin filter architecture. Every item passing through processing was screened for contaminants before it was logged. It was an old system, older than the Accord, older probably than the station itself. The Vethani were a species that had survived 3 planetary contamination events in their recorded history. You do not build a species that survives 3 contamination crises without teaching them to scan everything twice before they accept it into shared space. Our ration chits were printed in cadmium-red field press ink. Cadmium-red, standard human logistics supply, cheap, durable, legible under low light, registered as a Class 3 toxin precursor in the Vethani filter array. The scanner couldn't read the chit code. It flagged the document as a potential contamination vector and refused to log it. And without a logged ration chit, the Accord's intake protocol didn't recognize the bearer as a registered refugee. And without registration, the processing officer, a Vethani civil servant named Sarit Dal, 3.5 meters of gray-blue plated exoskeletal species in a beige administrative vest, had exactly one available action under her standing orders. Rejection and deportation hold. The line stretched back through 3 internal corridors. I'd walked the length of it coming in from the supply depot, and I'd counted families the way you count things when you're trying not to think about what you're looking at: small children, older people who'd been on their feet since before dawn, a man in a transit chair with a mechanical lung assist unit strapped to the frame. The composite floor was hard, and the station's climate system was calibrated for Vethani thermoregulation, which meant it was cold by human standards. Not dangerously cold, just the kind of cold that gets into your joints after 3 hours and becomes a different problem after 11. She had already issued the hold notice for the first family in the line when I got there. A woman named Priya Chandrasekharen, 2 children, a husband who was on oxygen supplementation for a lung condition he'd acquired in the evacuation. They were standing to the side of the main queue with a yellow hold tag on their intake folder. Their youngest was asleep against the father's shoulder. He was trying to hold still so he wouldn't wake her. I asked my liaison contact, a Vethani interpreter named Res, what the hold reason was. Res told me. I looked at my supply kit. I looked at the booklet of 300 chits, all of them printed in cadmium-red, all of them currently unreadable to every scanner in this building. I stood there for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then I walked to the counter. Sorit Dal had the plated forehead ridge and the amber compound eyes of her species, and she was looking at me the way civil servants look at people who approach the counter without an appointment, and with an expression that suggests they are about to make her day more complicated. I was, in fact, about to make her day more complicated. I set one chit on the counter, not through the scanner, just on the counter surface face up. I said through Res, "I understand your filter system can't read this. I'm not asking you to scan it. I'm asking you to hold it." She picked it up. She looked at it. I watched her compound eyes move across the face of the chit, and I waited. I said, "Can you read the code?" There was a pause that I still think about sometimes, in the way you think about pauses that contained everything. She said, "GX-441-R." That was it. 7 characters spoken aloud by a Vethani civil officer in the course of performing her official duties. Under Vethani administrative law so old it predated scanners, predated filter arrays, predated every contamination event in their recorded history. Oral acknowledgement of a unique identifier by a processing officer in the course of a review constituted formal registration of the item under review. It was a provision written in the era of ledger books, when you confirmed a document by reading its number aloud to a witness, and the witness wrote it down. Sorit Dal had a witness. I was standing right there. Res told me this in a whisper. I nodded. I said, still through Res, "Then I'd like to register the other 299 the same way." I don't know what Sorit Dal was thinking in the 3 seconds she spent looking at me after that. Res would not translate what she said under her breath before she cleared her throat and called for a secondary review window. I have my guesses. What I know is that she did it. She opened the administrative record and she read the codes. It took most of the afternoon. I stood at the counter and I handed her one chit at a time, and she held each one and read the code aloud into the record, and a Vethani administrative recorder at the adjacent station logged each reading as it was spoken. 299 codes. Some of them she read quickly, in the flat, even cadence of a person working through a task. Some she paused before, just for a moment. In a way I didn't fully understand until I started thinking about what 11 hours on a cold composite floor looked like to someone on the other side of the counter. The codes were not interesting. The people behind them were. The families moved through the intake gate as their codes cleared. Not all at once. The system still had to process the oral registrations through a secondary confirmation queue, which took additional time, but steadily, the way water moves through a narrowed channel when the pressure on one side finally equalizes. The Chandrasekharan family went through at the 40-minute mark. I watched the father carry his daughter through the gate in his arms, the oxygen unit rolling beside him on a belt clip his wife had rigged from transit webbing. The girl was awake by then. She was looking at the ceiling of the station with the particular unfocused attention of a young child who has slept somewhere unusual and is not yet sure where she is. She didn't look frightened. She looked interested. By the end of that day, she had read aloud 299 7-character codes into the administrative record of Station 11, and the line had cleared, and Priya Chandrasekharan's youngest had woken up and eaten something, and her husband had sat down for the first time in 11 hours. That was 2047. I didn't think much more about Sorit Dal after that. The dispersal had 17 more months of running, and I was occupied. 14 years later, in 2061, I got a package at my home address. No return identifier. Inside was a small laminated card, gray fiberpaper, 4 centimeters square, cadmium-red ink, faded but legible, GX-441-R. On the back, in Vethani administrative script, Res translated it for me later, were 5 words. I still know the number. I have it on my desk. I will have it there until I don't have a desk anymore. It is not a trophy. It is a reminder that the thing that mattered in the end was not a weapon or a plan or a sacrifice. It was a piece of gray paper and 7 characters spoken aloud by someone who didn't have to speak them. She didn't have to. That's the part I come back to. She read the number.